Korean Mafia boss was taking his fiancée home when he saw his ex crossing the crosswalk with twins. Mi Suk-chin's reflection cut across the bulletproof window of his armored Maybach as it glided through the neon-soaked streets of Gangnam. At 38, he was a legend whispered about in back rooms and feared in boardrooms. His jet-black hair was swept back with precision, revealing the faint scar above his left eyebrow, a reminder of the war that had crowned him king of the Jeom-sul syndicate. Face tattoos snaked along his jawline and neck, traditional symbols of loyalty and death, marking him as untouchable. The woman beside him, Gar Min-hee, 29, sat with the posture of someone who had never known anything but wealth and entitlement. Her sleek black hair fell like silk over her tailored crimson dress, diamond earrings catching the city lights with every turn of her head. She scrolled through her phone with manicured fingers, planning their engagement banquet as if she were arranging a corporate merger, which in many ways she was. The venue confirmed the ice sculpture, Min-hee said without looking up, her voice smooth and calculated. 3 meters tall, the dragon and phoenix intertwined, very symbolic. Mi Suk-chin's dark eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. Symbolic. That's what their entire relationship was, a symbol of power consolidation, a merger of 2 crime families that would monopolize the sole underground trade. At 35 months into this arrangement, he had learned to appreciate what Min-hee offered: strategic brilliance, political connections, and 0 emotional demands. No messy feelings, no vulnerable moments, no weakness. Your father's council approved the contract revisions, Mi Suk-chin said, his voice low and measured, the kind of tone that had ordered executions without flinching. The docks will be under unified control by next quarter. Min-hee smiled, sharp as a blade. As they should be. This is what real power looks like, Suk-chin, clean, efficient, uncompromised. Uncompromised. That word had become his mantra. After years of brutal wars, betrayals that left bodies in alleyways, and relationships that ended in bloodshed, he had built an empire on one principle: eliminate anything that could make you weak. Love was a liability. Attachment was a target on your back. Control was the only currency that mattered. The syndicate called him Bingson, the glacier, because nothing melted his composure. Not torture, not threats, not the ghosts of the men he'd killed before he turned 25. He had become exactly what the underworld demanded: a weapon without a conscience, a king without a heart. The traffic light ahead burned red, and the Maybach came to a smooth stop at the intersection of Gangnam-daro. Mi Suk-chin's phone vibrated with encrypted messages. A weapons shipment cleared customs, a rival family's lieutenant asking for terms, a judge requesting his donation. He ignored them all. Friday evenings were reserved for maintaining the illusion of normalcy, for playing the role of the legitimate businessman who happened to control half of Seoul's criminal infrastructure. I've been thinking, Min-hee said, finally setting her phone down. After the wedding, we should be seen more publicly. Charity galas, art auctions. It softens the image. Mi Suk-chin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Image management. That's what his life had become. A carefully curated performance of respectability covering rivers of blood. Whatever the strategy requires, he replied, the words automatic. The crosswalk ahead filled with Seoul's Friday night crowd. Office workers rushing to catch trains. Young couples laughing as they navigated the chaos, delivery drivers weaving through pedestrians with practiced ease. Mi Suk-chin watched them with the detachment of someone observing ants, their lives insignificant, their struggles invisible. Then everything stopped. A woman was crossing the street, moving carefully through the crowd. She carried something against her chest. No, 2 somethings. Bobbies. Twin infants bundled in soft blankets, secured in a worn fabric carrier that had seen better days. Her dark hair, loose waves cascading over her shoulders, caught the streetlight. She moved with cautious precision, every step deliberate, protecting the precious cargo strapped to her body. Mi Suk-chin's breath caught in his throat like a blade lodged between his ribs. Even from this distance, even with Seoul's chaos between them, he knew that face, the curve of her cheekbones, the way she held her shoulders, strong despite the weight she carried, the careful, protective way she walked, as if the entire world was a minefield. Gabrielle Iverson. His ex-fiancée, the woman he had exiled from his life exactly 1 year and 2 months ago in a cold apartment with rain hammering the windows. The woman he had loved enough to send away before his world consumed her. Gabrielle paused in the middle of the crosswalk as one of the bobbies began to cry. She shifted both infants with practiced ease, using one hand to gently stroke the distressed child's tiny face. Her lips moved. She was humming something, Mi Sukchin realized, or whispering comfort. The baby quieted almost immediately, and she continued forward, disappearing into the crowd on the opposite side of the street. But not before Mi Sukchin saw it. The boy twin's eyes, bright, piercing blue, locked onto the Maybach for one devastating second. Eyes that mirrored his own. A face that carried his bloodline like an accusation. Sukchin, Minhee's voice cut through the fog, sharp, impatient. The light's green, people are waiting. He blinked, realizing his hands had frozen on the steering wheel. Behind him, horns began to honk. Gabrielle had vanished into the soul night, swallowed by the city that had once been theirs together. But the image burned in his mind like a brand. Twin bobbies, approximately 4 months old if his mental calculation was correct. Exactly 9 months after he had shattered both their hearts and walked away, believing he was saving her life. Mi Sukchin's hands trembled, an earthquake in the body of a man who never trembled, as he pressed the accelerator. The glacier had just cracked, and everything he thought he had built was about to come crashing down. Mi Sukchin guided the Maybach through the next 3 intersections on autopilot, his mind fractured between the present and the ghost he'd just seen. Minhee's voice continued beside him, a smooth monologue about seating arrangements and imported champagne, but the words arrived distorted, as if transmitted through water. The Busan contingent will expect premium placement, she was saying, her finger tracing invisible diagrams on her phone's screen. Your uncle's faction can't be seated near my father's advisors, not after the Incheon incident. We'll need a buffer zone of neutral associates. He nodded mechanically, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. The steering wheel felt foreign under his palms, as if his hands belonged to someone else. Someone whose world hadn't just tilted on its axis at a random crosswalk in the heart of Seoul. Gabrielle with bobbies. Gabrielle with his bobbies if the timeline screaming in his head was correct. Gabrielle wearing clothes that had seen too many wash cycles, carrying children in a fabric sling that probably cost less than the watch on his wrist. Gabrielle, who he had sent away with enough money to disappear comfortably, now crossing streets on foot like someone who had burned through desperation and come out the other side with nothing but survival instinct. Are you listening? Minhee's voice sharpened, pulling his attention like a fishhook. Seating arrangements, he said, his voice emerging colder than intended. Busan faction, buffer zones, I heard you. She studied him with the clinical precision of someone trained to detect weakness. You seem distracted. The merger discussions require complete focus, Sukchin. My father is watching for any indication that you're not fully committed to this alliance. Fully committed. The phrase tasted like ash. What did commitment mean to people like them? Signatures on contracts written in invisible ink, promises that lasted only as long as they served strategic interests, loyalty that evaporated the moment a better offer materialized. His entire life had been built on these calculated exchanges, blood for territory, violence for respect, marriage for monopoly. I'm committed, he said, the lie smooth as silk because he'd been lying to himself for years. Committed to what? An empire that felt like a mausoleum, a marriage that was really just a corporate merger with a wedding dress, a legacy of fear that would outlive him by decades but mean nothing the moment his heart stopped beating. The Maybach turned onto the private road, leading to Minhee's family estate, passing through security gates that opened like metal jaws. The compound sprawled across 3 acres of manicured perfection, every hedge trimmed to geometric precision, every stone in the garden path calibrated for aesthetic balance. It was beautiful in the way a museum was beautiful, cold, untouchable, designed to be admired from a distance but never truly lived in. I'll see you tomorrow at the venue walkthrough, Minhee said as he brought the car to a stop in front of the main house. She leaned over, pressing a brief kiss to his cheek that felt like a signature on a document. Don't be late. The event coordinator has a schedule. He watched her walk away, her heels clicking against marble with metronomic precision. The front door opened before she reached it, staff who had learned to anticipate her arrival, to be invisible until needed, to exist only as extensions of her will. The door closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling. Mi Suk-chin sat in the idling car, staring at the fountain in the circular driveway. Water cascaded over sculpted stone dragons, each drop following the exact path it had followed yesterday and would follow tomorrow. Predictable, controlled, lifeless. His phone buzzed, not the regular phone, the other one. The encrypted device that only 3 people in the world had the number to. He pulled it from the hidden compartment in the dashboard and saw the name, D-Gun. His right-hand man. His oldest friend, if someone like Mi Suk-chin was allowed to have friends. The man who had taken a bullet meant for him in Busan 7 years ago and never mentioned it again. The only person in the syndicate who would tell him the truth, even when the truth was dangerous. Mi Suk-chin called him. "Boss." D-Gun's voice was gravel and smoke, the result of a throat wound that had nearly killed him during the territorial wars. "You're late checking in. Min-hee's security team logged your arrival 4 minutes ago. Everything's smooth." "I need you to find someone," Mi Suk-chin said, bypassing pleasantries because they'd stopped pretending years ago. "Gabrielle Iverson. Last known address was the apartment in Itaewon, but she's not there anymore." A pause. In that silence, Mi Suk-chin could hear D-Gun processing the name, connecting it to the past, to the woman who had almost made the glacier melt before protocol demanded her removal. "Gabrielle," D-Gun repeated carefully. "The foreign teacher, the one you—" "Yes." "Boss, she's been dark for over a year. After you paid her to disappear, she vanished clean. No digital footprint, no banking activity under her name. We assumed she left Korea." Mi Suk-chin's grip tightened on the phone. "She's still in Seoul. I saw her tonight. Gangnam-daro intersection around 7:15. She was on foot, carrying 2 infants in a fabric carrier." Another pause, longer this time. D-Gun was a strategist, a calculator of consequences. He would already be running the math, counting backwards from 9 months, arriving at the same devastating conclusion. "Boss," D-Gun said slowly, "are you asking me to?" "I'm asking you to find her. Track her location, her living situation, her work schedule. I want to know everything, where she sleeps, where she buys groceries, who she talks to." "But D-Gun," Mi Suk-chin's voice dropped to the register that made hardened killers nervous. "You touch nothing. You threaten no one. This is observation only. If anyone in the syndicate finds out what you're doing, we both know what happens." "Surveillance without elimination." D-Gun's tone shifted to something that might have been concern, if concern was allowed between men like them. "Boss, that's not protocol. If she's carrying your bloodline and Min-hee finds out." "Min-hee won't find out. Neither will the council. This stays between us until I understand what I'm looking at." "And when you understand it, then what?" Mi Suk-chin stared at the fountain, watching water follow its programmed path over stone dragons that had never breathed fire, had never lived at all. His empire, his glass castle, everything he'd killed for, everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd become, it suddenly felt as substantial as the reflection in the Maybach's bulletproof window. "Then I'll decide if I'm still the man they think I am," he said quietly, "or if I ever was." He ended the call before D-Gun could respond, before wisdom could intrude on whatever madness was taking root in his chest. The encrypted phone went back into its hidden compartment. The regular phone showed 17 missed messages, business that would normally command his immediate attention, fires that needed extinguishing, opportunities that required his ruthless decisiveness. He ignored them all. Instead, he sat in his armored fortress on wheels, surrounded by luxury that meant nothing, and thought about a woman in worn clothes carrying bobbies across a crosswalk, about how her shoulders had curved protectively around those tiny bodies, about how the boy's blue eyes had found his through metal and glass and the chaos of soul traffic, about how one moment of recognition had cracked something in him that he'd spent 20 years reinforcing. The glacier was melting, and he had no idea how to stop it. D-Gun's report arrived at 3 in the morning, delivered through encrypted channels that left no digital trace. Mi Suk-chin sat in his penthouse office, the lights of Seoul spreading beneath him like a constellation of broken promises. He hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. The moment he closed his eyes, he saw that crosswalk, those bobbies, those blue eyes that carried his blood. The file opened with a street address in Gyeorogu, a neighborhood that existed in Seoul's shadow, where rent was measured in survival rather than luxury. 40 minutes from Gangnam by subway, a lifetime away from the world he inhabited. The first photograph punched him in the chest. Gabrielle emerging from a building that looked like it had been scheduled for demolition 20 years ago and forgotten. Cracked concrete, rusted railings. The kind of structure where hope went to die slowly. She wore the same worn cardigan from the crosswalk, the twins strapped to her chest in that fabric carrier that probably provided more warmth than her apartment's heating system. D-Gun's notes were clinical, efficient, devastating. Subject resides in a 15-square-meter studio apartment, 4th floor, no elevator. Single window facing adjacent building. Shared bathroom facilities on each floor. Monthly rent, 450,000 won. Building has documented mold issues and inadequate heating. No security system. Front entrance lock is broken. Mi Suk-chin's jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. 450,000 won. He spent more than that on a single dinner with Min-hee's father. He'd authorized payments 10 times that amount for information that turned out to be useless. And Gabrielle was raising his children in a space smaller than his walk-in closet, in a building where the door didn't even lock properly. He scrolled to the next image. Gabrielle at a convenience store checkout counter, wearing a vest with the store's logo. Night shift, according to D-Gun's timestamp, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Her hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, her face illuminated by fluorescent lights that made the exhaustion under her eyes look like bruises. Subject works 2 jobs, convenience store clerk 6 nights per week, English tutor online platform afternoons between infant care, combined monthly income, approximately 1.8 million won. After rent and basic expenses, subject has minimal financial buffer, no childcare assistance, no family support visible. The photographs continued, each one a knife turning in his chest. Gabrielle pushing a second-hand stroller that had a broken wheel, forcing her to compensate with every step. Gabrielle at a street market, carefully calculating the cost of vegetables, putting items back when the total climbed too high. Gabrielle sitting on a bench outside her building at dawn, feeding both twins with the mechanical exhaustion of someone who had forgotten what rest felt like. One image stopped him cold. Gabrielle slumped against the wall of her apartment building's entrance, the twins asleep in their carrier, her eyes closed. She'd fallen asleep standing up, her body simply shutting down between the end of one shift and the beginning of another. Someone, maybe a neighbor, had placed a cardboard box under her as if she might collapse entirely. The date stamp showed this was 3 days ago. D-Gun's final note appeared at the bottom of the file. Birth records accessed. Twin males born April 14th, Seoul National University Hospital. Names, Kai Iverson and Ezra Iverson. Father, not listed. Mother paid hospital fees in cash installments over 3 months. Both infants healthy despite premature birth at 36 weeks. Mother declined all social services assistance. No indication she has contacted subject or syndicate for financial support. Mi Suk-chin read that last line 3 times, his hands trembling with something he couldn't name. Couldn't contact him. She'd given birth to his sons, his heirs, and suffered through premature labor alone. Had counted cash to pay hospital bills while recovering from childbirth. Had carried them home to that concrete box with mold in the walls and a broken lock on the door. Had worked 2 jobs while her body was still healing, while her milk came in, while the twins cried through the night in a space so small their cries probably echoed off every wall. And she had never once called him, never once demanded what he owed her, never once used his children as leverage in the only game where leverage was currency. The syndicate believed that weakness should be purged, and that suffering is the penalty for leaving. If you refuse to side with a system that punishes a mother for surviving, hit that like button. Let's show the algorithm we stand against tyranny. The anger that rose in Mi Suk-chin's chest was molten, volcanic, directed at everything he'd built. At the system that demanded he cut away anything soft. At the protocol that required he exile the one person who'd seen him as human rather than weapon. At himself for believing that money could substitute for presence, that paying someone to disappear was mercy rather than cowardice. He'd given her 3 million won that night in Itaewon, pressed it into her hands like a severance package while rain hammered the windows. Told her it was for her protection, for her future, for her safety. Told her that loving him would get her killed. Told her to disappear so thoroughly that even he couldn't find her. She disappeared, all right. Straight into poverty. Straight into exploitation. Straight into a life where sleeping standing up was normal, where counting coins for vegetables was daily mathematics, where raising twins alone in a moldy studio was the price of surviving his world. The 3 million one, enough to live comfortably for a year if spent carefully, had probably gone to hospital bills, to deposits she couldn't otherwise make, to the basics of bringing 2 lives into a world that didn't want them, and when it ran out, she'd simply endured. Mi Suk-chin pulled up another photograph, this one clearly taken through a telephoto lens. Gabrielle's face in profile, looking down at the twins as she changed their clothes on what appeared to be a folding table that doubled as her kitchen counter. The expression on her face wasn't the exhaustion from the other images. It was something else, something fierce and protective and absolutely unbreakable. She was smiling. Despite everything, despite the poverty, the exhaustion, the impossible mathematics of survival, she was smiling at his sons with a tenderness that made his chest feel like it was caving in. This was what strength actually looked like. Not the violence he'd mastered, not the fear he'd cultivated, not the empire he'd built on bones and betrayal. This, a woman who worked through the night and slept standing up and counted coins for cabbage, and still smiled at her children like they were the only wealth that mattered. He had called her weak when he sent her away, had told himself he was protecting her from his darkness, had convinced himself that she couldn't survive his world, that her softness would get her killed, that loving her was the cruelest thing he could do. But she wasn't weak. She'd never been weak. She had survived everything he'd thrown at her, the breakup, the pregnancy, the poverty, the isolation, and had done it without compromising the core of who she was. Had refused to become hard and cold and brutal. Had refused to use his children as weapons. Had refused to let his world turn her into something broken. She was stronger than him, than the entire syndicate, than every killer he commanded and every law he enforced. And he had left her to fight alone. Mi Suk-chin closed the file, his hands steady now, his anger crystallizing into something sharper and more dangerous. Protocol said he should eliminate complications. The syndicate's law said mixed-blood children were impurities, that women who left were liabilities, that mercy was suicide in slow motion. Protocol could burn. He pulled up his encrypted messenger and typed a single line to D-Gun. I need an address, and I need you to make sure I arrive alone. The response came immediately. Boss, if you go to her, everything changes. Min-hee will find out eventually. The council will demand action. You're walking into a war. Mi Suk-chin stared at the photograph of Gabrielle smiling at their sons, at the concrete walls that imprisoned her, at the exhaustion that had become her permanent expression everywhere, except in that one moment of tenderness. Then it's a war worth fighting, he typed back. Send me the address. Mi Suk-chin stood in the darkness of Gabrielle's apartment, and the silence was suffocating. 15 square meters. D-Gun's measurement had been accurate, but numbers couldn't capture the reality of walls that pressed in like a coffin, of air that smelled like mold and yesterday's rice, of space so small that breathing felt like theft from the twins sleeping in a makeshift crib fashioned from a drawer lined with blankets. He'd picked the lock, a skill from before he'd had people to pick locks for him, and let himself into her life like the intruder he was. The broken entrance lock downstairs had been almost insulting in its simplicity. Anyone could walk in. Any threat could climb those stairs. Any danger could reach his sons, while Gabrielle worked through the night selling instant noodles to drunk college students. The apartment was painfully clean despite its decay. Every surface scrubbed, every corner organized with the precision of someone who understood that chaos in small spaces became suffocation. A folding table served as kitchen counter, workspace, and dining area. A hot plate sat next to a small rice cooker, 3 plates stacked beside a single cup, the economics of survival rendered in objects. Baby clothes hung drying on a cord stretched across the room's only window. Tiny shirts and onesies, threadbare from washing, arranged by size with methodical care. A shelf held formula cans, the cheap brand, and diapers bought in whatever quantity the budget allowed rather than what was needed. Everything spoke of calculation, of mathematics performed in exhaustion, of choices between necessities because there was no room for wants. Mi Suk-chin had killed men in rooms larger than this, had tortured information from people in spaces with better ventilation, had stored weapons in closets that could swallow this entire apartment twice over. And Gabrielle had given birth to his heirs and brought them here. To this. To walls that wept moisture and floors that creaked with rot, and a bathroom she shared with strangers down a hallway that probably wasn't safe after dark. The twins stirred in their drawer crib, and his breath caught. He moved closer, his footsteps silent from years of approaching targets who shouldn't hear him coming. Kai and Ezra. D-Gun's report had named them, but seeing them in person made them real in a way that surveillance photographs couldn't capture. 4 months old. Identical except for a small birthmark above Kai's left eyebrow, the same location as Mi Suk-chin's scar. Both had thick dark hair already growing in with texture that came from Gabrielle's genes. Both had skin that blended his Korean heritage with her mixed background. Both had tiny fists curled against their chests like they were ready to fight the world before they'd even learned to sit up. They looked fragile, breakable, impossibly small. They looked exactly like the things he'd spent 20 years ensuring could never be used against him. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled him back into the shadows. 4 flights climbed slowly, each step heavy with exhaustion. A pause on the landing, Gabrielle catching her breath, probably, or bracing herself for whatever waited on the other side of her door. Keys jingled. The lock turned. She entered carrying 2 plastic bags of groceries that had cost her careful deliberation at the market. Her convenience store vest was still on, name tag crooked, hair escaping its ponytail in ways that suggested she'd been pulling at it during her shift. Her face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd worked through the night and would need to be awake again in 3 hours when the twins demanded feeding. She didn't see him immediately, moved to the folding table, setting down the bags with a sigh that came from somewhere deep in her bones, pulled out formula, the cheap brand, and a container of something that might have been soup, started to remove her vest. Then she froze. Her body went rigid in the way prey freezes when it realizes the predator has been watching the whole time. Her hand moved slowly toward the bag, toward something inside it, a knife, maybe, or pepper spray, some inadequate defense against the kind of danger that had learned to pick locks in the dark. Don't! Mi Suk-chin's voice emerged from the shadows, low and measured, the tone that made armed men reconsider their life choices. I'm not here to hurt you. Gabrielle spun, and the fear in her eyes hit him harder than any bullet he'd taken. But the fear lasted only a moment before something else replaced it, something fierce and maternal and absolutely unafraid of dying if it meant protecting what mattered. Get out! Her voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. Get out of my home right now, or I swear to God, Suk-chin. They're mine. He stepped into the thin light from the window, letting her see his face, see the recognition he'd been carrying since that crosswalk. Kai and Ezra, 9 months ago I sent you away. 4 months ago you gave birth to my sons. Her jaw clenched, and he watched her run the same calculation he'd run 100 times since D-Gun's report. Denial was impossible. The timeline was too clean, the genetics too obvious. The boy's birthmark alone would convince a court. Yes, she said finally, the words sharp as broken glass. They're yours biologically, genetically, whatever box you need checked for your syndicate's records. But that's where it ends, Suk-chin. You don't get to walk into our lives because you suddenly decided to give a damn. You were pregnant. His hands curled into fists at his sides, anger bleeding through despite his control. You were carrying my children and you lived through it alone. You gave birth alone. You've been raising them in this. He gestured at the apartment, at the poverty that surrounded them, at the impossibility of everything she'd endured. Why didn't you tell me? Her laugh was bitter, hollow, the sound of someone who'd stopped expecting different outcomes. Tell you? Tell the man who paid me to disappear that I was pregnant with his children. Tell the head of the GM Soul syndicate that he was about to become a father. Tell Bingson the glacier that he'd created something he couldn't control. She moved between him and the crib, her body a barrier despite the size difference, despite knowing he could move her aside with one hand. You made yourself very clear that night, Suk-chin. You told me that loving you would get me killed, that your world would consume anything soft. That the kindest thing you could do was cut me loose before I became a target painted on your back. I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself. The words cracked like a whip, and one of the twins whimpered in response. Gabrielle's voice dropped immediately, instinct overriding anger. You were protecting your empire, your reputation, your carefully constructed isolation. Don't rewrite history and call it mercy. Mi Sukchin's chest felt like it was being crushed. So you decided to suffer in silence, to raise my children in poverty rather than make them targets in your war. She stepped closer, and he saw the steel in her eyes that he'd fallen in love with before he'd convinced himself love was weakness. Rather than turn them into leverage for your enemies, rather than watch them grow up learning that human life is a commodity and violence is currency. Yes, Sukchin, I chose poverty over poison. The twins were fully awake now, making the small sounds that preceded crying. Gabrielle glanced at them, then back at Mi Sukchin, her expression torn between maternal instinct and the need to maintain this confrontation. You need to leave, she said quietly. Before they wake up fully, before they see you, before this becomes more complicated than it already is. I want to meet them. The words emerged raw, unplanned, stripped of all the control he'd spent decades perfecting. I want to know my sons. Why? The question hung in the air like smoke. So you can claim them as heirs, so you can drag them into the syndicate, so you can turn them into weapons like you. So I can keep them safe. They are safe, here, with me, away from you. Mi Sukchin looked around the apartment, at the mold on the walls, at the broken window seal, at the door that didn't lock, at the poverty that threatened them in ways different from his world, but no less dangerous. This isn't safe, Gabrielle. This is survival by inches. This is one illness, one missed paycheck, one disaster away from catastrophe. And your world, she laughed again, that hollow sound. Your world is one betrayal, one power shift, one enemy away from their execution. I chose my catastrophe. I get to choose theirs too. He started to speak, but she held up her hand. If you want to meet them, she said slowly, each word calculated, you leave your weapon at the door, not in your jacket, not in your boot, not in whatever hidden holster you're wearing. You leave every piece of your world outside this apartment, or you don't come in at all. Mi Sukchin met her eyes, those eyes that had once looked at him with love instead of fear, and understood this was the test. The line in the sand. The moment where he chose between protocol and something that had no name in his language. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the Sig Sauer P226 he'd carried for 15 years, set it on the folding table beside her cheap groceries, reached into his boot and pulled out the backup knife, set it beside the gun, pulled the garrote wire from his watch band and added it to the collection. There, he said quietly, I'm unarmed. I'm asking permission. I'm asking you to let me be someone other than what I've become. Gabrielle stared at the weapons, at him, at the twins who were crying now in earnest. Her expression shifted through a dozen calculations he couldn't read. Finally, she nodded toward the crib. 5 minutes, she said. You get 5 minutes. Then you leave, and we figure out what happens next on my terms, not yours. Mi Sukchin moved toward his sons, his hands trembling, his heart hammering in a way it never had before facing death. This, he realized, was what terror actually felt like. Mi Sukchin had held many things in his hands, guns that had ended bloodlines, knives that had carved territories into flesh, briefcases containing enough cash to buy politicians and silence witnesses, gold bars stamped with symbols of empires that had risen and fallen on his orders, documents that sentenced men to death with his signature alone. Nothing had ever felt as heavy as the 4-month-old infant Gabrielle placed in his arms. Kai, the one with the birthmark, stared up at him with blue eyes that mirrored his own, eyes that carried no fear because fear was something learned, not inherited. The baby's tiny hand wrapped around Mi Sukchin's finger with a grip that was both impossibly weak and absolutely unbreakable. 4 months old. 8 pounds, maybe 9. Lighter than the ammunition magazines he carried. More fragile than any empire he'd built. More terrifying than any enemy he'd faced. Support his head, Gabrielle said quietly, her hands hovering close but not touching, ready to intervene if the trained killer proved incompetent at the most basic human task. He can't hold it up on his own yet, and don't tense up like that. He can feel it. Bobby's sense fear. Mi Sukchin's muscles were coiled tight, his body in the defensive posture that had kept him alive through 2 decades of warfare. He forced himself to breathe, to loosen his grip, to hold this tiny human as if he were something precious rather than something that might shatter at any moment. The baby made a small sound, not quite crying, not quite cooing, and shifted against his chest. The world tilted. This was his son, his blood, his genetic legacy rendered in skin and bone and impossibly tiny fingernails. This was what he'd created with Gabrielle in those stolen months before protocol demanded he destroy the only thing he'd ever built with love instead of violence. This was the consequence of being human for just long enough to forget he'd trained himself to be a weapon. "You're holding him too tight," Gabrielle said, and there was something in her voice, not quite forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of recognition that he was trying. "Relax your arms, let him settle." Mi Sukchin adjusted his grip, mimicking the way Gabrielle had held Kai before transferring him over. The baby's breathing was fast, his chest rising and falling with the rapid metabolism of new life. His hair was thick and dark, standing up in ways that genetics and gravity would eventually tame. His skin was warm, feverishly so, and Mi Sukchin felt panic spike before Gabrielle noticed his expression. "That's normal," she said. "Bobby's run hot, he's not sick, he's just alive." Alive. The word resonated in ways Mi Sukchin wasn't prepared for. Kai was alive in a way that had nothing to do with not being dead. Alive with potential and possibility and futures that weren't written yet. Alive in the way Mi Sukchin had stopped being somewhere around age 12, when his father had beaten mercy out of him and the syndicate had finished the job. Ezra began fussing in the drawer crib, and Gabrielle lifted him with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this alone for 4 months. She brought him over, and suddenly Mi Sukchin was looking at both of them. Identical faces with subtle differences he'd need years to fully catalog. Ezra's eyes were darker, his expression more serious, his tiny brow furrowed as if he were already contemplating the mathematics of existence. "You want to try holding both?" Gabrielle asked, and it wasn't really a question so much as a challenge. "Can you handle the weight of what you created? Can you carry the responsibility you abandoned?" "Show me how." She adjusted his arms, creating a cradle that could support both infants. The weight doubled, and Mi Sukchin felt his muscles compensate automatically, the same muscles that had carried bodies, weapons, the physical evidence of his violence. Now they held something infinitely more precious and infinitely more dangerous to everything he'd built. Kai made a small sound and turned his face into Mi Sukchin's chest, seeking warmth or milk or the simple comfort of being held. Ezra's hand found Kai's, and the twins' fingers intertwined with the unconscious solidarity of 2 humans who'd shared a womb and would share a lifetime of being each other's first memory. The 5 minutes Gabrielle had promised him stretched into something elastic, unmeasurable. Time existed differently when you held your children for the first time. Seconds became hours, and hours collapsed into moments, and suddenly the entire architecture of Mi Sukchin's life, the empire, the violence, the carefully constructed isolation, felt like scaffolding around an empty building. This was what mattered. These 2 tiny humans who hadn't asked to be born into his world, who carried his blood without carrying his sins, who looked at him without judgment because they didn't yet know what judgment was. They were innocence in its purest form, and holding them felt like holding a mirror to everything he'd become. "Your 5 minutes are up," Gabrielle said softly, but she didn't move to take them back. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, wariness mixed with something else. Maybe recognition that whatever she'd seen in him a year ago, whatever had made her love him before protocol destroyed them, was still buried somewhere under the ice. "I've held gold bars worth 50 million won," Mi Sukchin said, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion if he still remembered how to access those. "I've carried briefcases with enough cash to buy buildings. I've lifted bodies and weapons and the weight of an entire organization on my shoulders for 20 years. He looked down at Kai and Ezra, at their tiny faces and impossible fragility, and the way they trusted him completely despite having no reason to trust anyone. "Nothing has ever been heavier than this," he finished. "Nothing has ever mattered more." Gabrielle's expression cracked, just slightly, the armor she'd worn since he entered her apartment showing its first fissure. "They're heavier than they look," she said quietly. I learned that the first night in the hospital when the nurse left me alone with them. I thought, how can something so small feel so heavy? But it's not their weight, is it? It's what they represent. It's knowing that everything you do from this moment forward will shape who they become. Mi Suk-chin nodded, unable to speak past the thing lodged in his throat. Kai had fallen asleep against his chest, the baby's breathing synchronizing with his own. Ezra was still awake, studying him with those serious eyes, making calculations that an infant brain couldn't possibly make, but somehow seemed to be making anyway. I've shaped men into killers, Mi Suk-chin said finally. I've turned boys into weapons. I've built an empire on the principle that compassion is weakness and mercy is suicide. Everything I touch becomes contaminated by violence. He looked at Gabrielle, at the woman who'd survived his abandonment and his poverty and his world's cruelty, without letting it destroy the core of who she was. How do I hold them without contaminating them? How do I be in their lives without turning them into what I am? Gabrielle reached out and adjusted Ezra's blanket, her hands gentle despite everything. You start by acknowledging that you're contaminated, she said. You start by recognizing that the way you've lived isn't the only way to live. You start by choosing, every single day, to be something different than what the syndicate made you. And if I can't, if the violence is too deep, if I'm too broken to be what they need. She met his eyes, and he saw the fierceness that had made him fall in love with her before he'd convinced himself love was a liability. Then you leave, she said simply. You walk away and you let them grow up without knowing what you are, because they deserve better than a father who's still a monster. They deserve better than growing up learning that human life is currency and power is the only goal worth pursuing. Kai stirred against his chest, making small sounds that signaled waking. Mi Suk-chin looked down at his son, his heir, and felt something crack in the glacial core he'd spent decades freezing. I don't know how to be a father, he admitted, the words foreign and painful, confession in a language he'd forgotten how to speak. Neither did I know how to be a mother, Gabrielle said. 4 months ago, I was a teacher who could barely keep a houseplant alive. Now I'm responsible for 2 human beings who will die if I stop paying attention for more than a few minutes. You learn by doing. You learn by failing. You learn by choosing them over everything else every single time. She paused, then added quietly, the question isn't whether you know how to be a father. The question is whether you're willing to become something other than what the syndicate made you, whether you're willing to let these bobbies unmake the monster. Mi Suk-chin looked at Kai and Ezra, at their tiny faces and impossible trust, and the weight of their existence pressing against his chest like a physical force. He thought about his empire, his reputation, his carefully constructed life. He thought about Minhee and the merger and the syndicate's laws that viewed mixed-blood children as impurities to be purged. He thought about what it would cost to choose this, to choose them, to let himself be unmade and rebuilt into something that could hold bobbies without contaminating them with violence. The price was everything he'd ever built. The reward was everything that actually mattered. I'm willing, he said, and felt the glacier crack completely, breaking apart into something that might eventually resemble a human being capable of love. Gabrielle took Ezra from his arms, but left Kai sleeping against his chest. Then you get more than 5 minutes, she said. You get as long as it takes to prove you mean it. Mi Suk-chin held his son, and felt the weight of an empire becoming lighter than the weight of one tiny human who trusted him completely. The monster was beginning to unmake itself. And for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't afraid of what might replace it. The first time Mi Suk-chin skipped a syndicate meeting to install a carbon monoxide detector in Gabrielle's apartment, D-Gun called him 3 times. The second time he arrived late to a territorial negotiation, because he'd been researching the difference between baby formula brands. His lieutenants exchanged glances that would have gotten them killed a month ago. The third time he canceled dinner with Minhee's family to fix the broken crib leg that had been threatening to collapse for weeks. He stopped making excuses altogether. He was living 2 lives, and the fracture between them was widening into a chasm he couldn't bridge much longer. By day, or more accurately, by the hours Minhee and the syndicate could account for, he was still Bingson the Glacier. Still attended the strategy meetings where territories were divided like cuts of meat. Still signed off on operations that would result in violence he'd stopped thinking about decades ago. still played the role of engaged fiancé to a woman who viewed their upcoming marriage as a corporate merger with better catering. But the nights belonged to Girogu, to the cramped apartment with mold on the walls, to Gabrielle, who'd started allowing him longer visits as long as he left his weapons in the car and his syndicate phone turned off, to Kai and Ezra, who were learning to recognize his face, his voice, his presence as something that meant safety rather than threat. Mi Suk-shin had learned to kill a man in 14 different ways before he turned 18, had mastered the art of torture, intimidation, strategic violence, had built an empire on the principle that fear was the only reliable currency. But changing a diaper, that was humbling in ways warfare had never been. "You're doing it wrong," Gabrielle said for the 5th time that week, watching him struggle with the tabs on Ezra's diaper. The baby was squirming, unimpressed with Mi Suk-shin's fumbling attempts at basic childcare. "The tabs go in the front, not Suk-shin, that's backwards." He disarmed bombs with steadier hands. "How is this more complicated than field stripping a weapon?" "Because weapons don't pee on you mid-change." She took over with the efficiency of practice, demonstrating the proper technique while Ezra gurgled happily at the ceiling. "And they don't have tiny legs that won't stay still. You have to be gentle but firm, like you're handling something precious that might explode." So exactly like a bomb. She almost smiled. Almost. The warmth between them was still fragile, still weighted with everything he'd done and everything he represented. But it was there, growing in the spaces between diaper changes and 3 a.m. feedings and the strange domesticity of a crime lord learning to burp an infant. The security upgrades had been non-negotiable. Mi Suk-shin couldn't change the fact that Gabrielle lived in a building where the front door didn't lock, but he could install a reinforced deadbolt on her apartment door. Could add a chain lock and a security camera disguised as a smoke detector. Could ensure that if anyone came for his sons, there would be warning and barriers and time to respond. "This is excessive," Gabrielle had protested when he'd shown up with the equipment. "It's a studio apartment in Girogu, not a military installation." "It's where my children sleep," he'd replied, already marking the doorframe for the reinforced strike plate. Excessive is the minimum acceptable standard. She'd let him install everything, though he caught her watching him work with an expression that suggested she was calculating the cost of each upgrade, and adding it to the debt she refused to acknowledge she didn't owe him. The learning curve was brutal. Mi Suk-shin had spent 20 years perfecting violence, and now he had to unlearn the instinct to grip too hard, move too fast, react with the force that had kept him alive in a world where hesitation meant death. Bobby's required gentleness he'd systematically eliminated from his behavioral repertoire. "You're holding him like he's a briefcase," Gabrielle observed one night as he attempted to soothe a crying Kai. "Loosen your arms, rock a little. He needs to feel secure, not restrained." "I don't know the difference." "That's the problem." But she showed him anyway, adjusting his posture, demonstrating the subtle motion that seemed to quiet the baby's distress. Her hands on his arms were clinical, professional, carefully avoiding anything that might suggest the intimacy they'd once shared. Security and restraint aren't the same thing. One makes them feel safe, the other makes them feel trapped. He wondered if she was still talking about the Bobbies. The strange peace he found in that cramped apartment terrified him more than any threat he'd faced. There was something hypnotic about the 3 a.m. feedings, the exhausted quiet broken only by the sound of Bobby's drinking formula and the ambient noise of Seoul outside the window. Something meditative about folding tiny clothes, about washing bottles, about the mundane, repetitive tasks that formed the architecture of survival. The syndicate was chaos barely controlled through violence. This was order created through care. And Mi Suk-shin was discovering that the latter was infinitely more difficult and infinitely more satisfying than the former. "We need to talk about the living situation," he said one evening, after successfully changing both twins without assistance and feeling a surge of accomplishment that was pathetic given his resume. "This apartment isn't sustainable. The mold, the space constraints, the security issues." "Don't," Gabrielle's voice went sharp. "Don't start." "Start what? Acknowledging reality. Gabrielle, you're living in 15 square meters with 2 infants. You work 2 jobs to afford rent on a place that's barely habitable. I can." "You can what? Solve it with money?" She was folding laundry, the endless Sisyphean task of keeping tiny humans clothed, and her hands moved with aggressive efficiency. You can install me in a penthouse somewhere, buy me security and comfort and everything money can provide. Yes, he didn't understand why this was an argument. I have resources. I can move you somewhere safe, somewhere the twins have room to grow, somewhere you're not working yourself to death just to. With what money, Suk-Chin? She turned to face him, and her eyes were blazing. With money from the syndicate, money that came from drugs and weapons and human trafficking, money that's literally soaked in blood. You want me to raise your sons in a fortress built on corpses. I want you to raise them somewhere. They're not breathing mold spores. And I want them to grow up knowing that comfort purchased with suffering isn't comfort at all. She threw down the tiny shirt she'd been folding. Do you know what your money represents to me? It represents every person your organization has destroyed, every family you've torn apart, every life you've commodified. I'm barely surviving in this apartment, but at least I'm surviving on my own terms, with money I earned doing work that didn't require anyone else's pain. Mi Suk-Chin felt frustration building in his chest. This isn't about pride. This is about the twins' well-being, about your well-being. You're exhausted, Gabrielle. You fell asleep standing up last week. You're working 2 jobs while caring for infants alone. How long before you collapse? How long before something goes wrong and there's no backup, no support, no safety net? So your solution is to make me dependent on blood money, to compromise everything I believe in for the sake of convenience, for the sake of survival. I am surviving. Her voice cracked, and he saw the exhaustion under the anger, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting alone for so long she'd forgotten what support looked like. I'm surviving without becoming complicit in your world. I'm surviving without teaching my sons that violence is acceptable if it purchases comfort. I'm surviving on my own terms, and that matters more than square footage or security systems or whatever fortress you think you can build around us. Min-hee views these children as impurities that need to be erased to protect the family image. This kind of toxic gatekeeping destroys lives. If you think every child deserves a right to exist regardless of their lineage, subscribe to the channel right now. Don't let the Min-hees of the world win. Mi Suk-Chin stared at her, at the woman who'd rather suffocate in poverty than compromise her principles, at the strength it took to refuse help when help was desperately needed. The syndicate would call her foolish, prideful, stupidly stubborn. The syndicate had never understood that this was what integrity actually looked like. What if the money wasn't from the syndicate? He asked quietly. What if I, divested, separated my personal finances from the organization's operations? Can you even do that? I don't know, honest answer for once. The lines are blurred. Everything I own because of what I've done. There's no clean money in my world, Gabrielle. It's all contaminated somewhere along the chain. She sat down heavily on the folding chair that served as her only furniture besides the sleeping mat and the drawer crib. Then we stay here, in this apartment that's too small and too moldy and barely affordable. Because at least here, I know exactly what I'm working with. At least here, there's no illusion that comfort doesn't have a cost. Even if it's costing you your health, your sanity. Even then, she looked at the twins, sleeping peacefully in their drawer despite the poverty surrounding them. Because the alternative is teaching them that the ends justify the means, that comfort matters more than conscience, that it's acceptable to benefit from others' suffering as long as you personally didn't pull the trigger. Mi Suk-Chin sat down on the floor. There was nowhere else to sit, and leaned against the wall that wept moisture. He'd negotiated with warlords and politicians and psychopaths, had found common ground with people who measured human life in profit margins, had convinced enemies to become allies through strategic applications of fear and incentive. But he couldn't convince one exhausted mother to accept help, because the help was poisoned at its source. I'm trying to be different, he said finally. I'm trying to become someone who can be in their lives without contaminating them, but I don't know how to separate who I am from what I've done. The syndicate isn't just my job, Gabrielle, it's my identity. It's the only thing I've ever been good at besides hurting people. Then maybe that's what you need to figure out, she said softly. Not how to provide for us with blood money, but how to become someone whose money isn't blood-soaked. Not how to build us a fortress, but how to stop being the kind of person who needs fortresses in the first place. She stood up, moving to check on the twins even though they were sleeping peacefully. You want to help, really help, then start dismantling the empire that made this situation necessary. Start becoming someone who can support his children without compromising their mother's soul. Start choosing them over the syndicate every single time until the choice becomes permanent. Mi Suk-chin looked at his hands, the hands that had killed and tortured and built an empire on violence. The hands that were learning, slowly and clumsily, to hold bobbies and change diapers and fold tiny clothes. The hands that existed in two worlds simultaneously and couldn't reconcile the contradiction much longer. That would mean war, he said. With Min-hee, with the council, with everyone who has a stake in keeping me exactly where I am. I know, Gabrielle met his eyes. So you have to decide what kind of war you want to fight, the war to maintain your empire, or the war to become someone worthy of being their father. Outside, Seoul hummed with the chaos of 10 million lives lived in proximity. Inside the cramped apartment, two bobbies slept peacefully, unaware that their existence was forcing their father to choose between everything he'd built and everything that actually mattered. Mi Suk-chin closed his eyes and felt the double life splitting him in half. Something would have to break soon. He just hoped it wouldn't be him. Gar Min-hee received the manila envelope during her morning Pilates session, which should have been her first indication that protocol was collapsing. Nobody interrupted her exercise routine. Nobody dared breach the sanctuary of her private gym in the family compound unless the matter was urgent enough to justify potential execution. Her assistant, a nervous woman named Yuna who'd learned to anticipate Min-hee's moods with survival-level precision, approached with the envelope held at arm's length, as if it might detonate. "Ma'am," Yuna said, her voice carefully neutral. "This arrived by courier, marked urgent and confidential. The sender requested you review it immediately." Min-hee maintained her plank position for another 30 seconds. She didn't break routine for anyone, before transitioning smoothly to standing. She accepted the envelope without comment, noted the absence of return address, and dismissed Yuna with a gesture that meant leave and forget you saw this. The envelope wasn't sealed. Another protocol violation. Whoever sent this wanted her to know they had access, had information, had leverage. Min-hee's fingers were steady as she extracted the contents, but her mind was already calculating threats and responses and the appropriate level of retaliation for this breach of security. The first photograph stopped her cold. Mi Suk-chin stood on a street corner in Gyeogu, a neighborhood she wouldn't visit without a hazmat suit and armed escort, pushing a stroller. Not observing a stroller. Not standing near a stroller. Pushing it, with his hands on the handle, in the unmistakable posture of someone who'd done this multiple times before. The image quality was excellent. Professional surveillance equipment. Her eyes traced the details. Mi Suk-chin's casual clothes, so different from his usual tailored suits. The way his shoulders curved protectively over the stroller. The expression on his face, not the cold mask he wore to syndicate meetings, but something softer. Something almost human. The second photograph was worse. Mi Suk-chin entering a dilapidated apartment building, carrying grocery bags. The timestamp showed this was taken at 11 p.m. when he told her he had syndicate business in Itaewon. She'd believed him because lying about mundane logistics wasn't his style. Mi Suk-chin killed with honesty. He didn't waste energy on small deceptions. Apparently, that had changed. The third photograph made her hands tremble with something that definitely wasn't jealousy. Min-hee didn't do jealousy. That was for people who confused business arrangements with romance, but was much more dangerous. Political rage. Mi Suk-chin sat on a worn couch in what appeared to be the world's smallest apartment, holding two infants. His expression was unguarded in a way she'd never seen, his usual control completely absent. He was smiling at the bobbies, actually smiling, the kind of genuine expression she'd assumed he was physiologically incapable of producing, while a woman sat beside him. Not just any woman. A foreign woman with dark skin and loose hair and the kind of beauty that came from genetics rather than surgical precision. The woman was watching Mi Suk-chin with an expression that combined wariness and something else. Something that suggested history, intimacy, the complicated emotional mathematics of people who'd shared more than strategic alliances. Min-hee flipped through the remaining photographs with mechanical efficiency. Mi Suk-chin installing a security system. Mi Suk-chin at a convenience store buying formula. Mi Suk-chin doing laundry, as if he were some common house husband instead of the head of the GM Seoul syndicate. Each image was a violation of everything their engagement represented. The note attached to the final photograph was brief, typed on plain paper with no signature. Thought you should know what your fiancé does during his business meetings. The twins are 4 months old. The timeline suggests conception occurred shortly before your engagement was formalized. The woman is Gabrielle Iverson, former English teacher, no criminal record. She lives in poverty while he builds her a Fortress 1 security system at a time. Your father's counsel doesn't know yet, but they will. Min-hee set down the photographs with hands that were now perfectly steady. The initial shock had burned away, replaced by the cold calculation that had made her father's favorite strategist before she'd even graduated university. This wasn't about romance. This was about power architecture, and someone had just shown her that the foundation she'd been building on was compromised. She pulled out her personal phone, not the one monitored by her father's security team, but the one she used for matters that required deniability, and dialed a number she'd memorized but never called. Yes, the voice on the other end belonged to Lieutenant Yi Taeyong, a mid-level operative in Mi Suk-chin's organization who'd been making quiet inquiries about alternative leadership structures. A man whose ambition exceeded his current station. A traitor waiting for the right opportunity. The photographs, Min-hee said without preamble, are they authentic? Completely. I've been documenting his movements for 3 weeks. He visits the woman and the children 5 times per week, usually late evening. Stays for hours. Misses syndicate meetings. Lies about his location. The behavioral change is dramatic and sustained. Min-hee walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the compound. Below, her father's guards patrolled with automatic weapons, protecting an empire built on the principle that weakness was death and sentiment was suicide. Everything the Gar family had built, 3 generations of careful expansion, strategic violence, ruthless elimination of threats, rested on alliances that couldn't tolerate this level of compromise. The children, she said, you're certain they're his. The resemblance is unmistakable. Facial recognition software shows 94% probability of paternity. The timeline is perfect, exactly 9 months from when he ended his previous relationship to when she gave birth. He's been hiding them, but not well. He's getting sloppy. Sloppy, that word was death in their world. Sloppy meant vulnerable. Vulnerable meant exploitable. And exploitable meant irrelevant. The woman refuses his financial support, Taeyong continued. She's living in poverty by choice, working 2 jobs, barely surviving. She's proud, principled, completely unsuitable for our world. And the children, he paused, letting the implication hang. Mixed blood, foreign heritage, everything the old guard considers contamination. Min-hee's reflection in the window showed her face perfectly composed, but her mind was racing through consequences and contingencies. The engagement to Mi Suk-chin was more than personal ambition. It was the cornerstone of a merger that would consolidate Seoul's entire underground economy. Her father's faction plus the GM Seoul syndicate would create an unstoppable monopoly. But that required Mi Suk-chin to be the glacier, cold, controlled, unburdened by sentiment. A man playing house with his secret family in Gyeonggu, that wasn't the partner her father had negotiated for. That was a liability that would fracture the entire alliance the moment the council discovered it. And they would discover it. Secrets in the syndicate had a half-life measured in weeks, not years. Someone would talk. Someone would photograph. Someone would use this information as leverage or revenge or simple opportunism. The question wasn't if the council would find out. The question was whether Min-hee would control the narrative when they did. "What's your recommendation?" she asked, though she already knew. Had known the moment she'd seen that photograph of Mi Suk-chin smiling at infants as if they mattered more than empire. "Elimination," Taeyong said, his voice carrying the casual certainty of someone who'd made this calculation many times before. "The woman and the children, clean, professional, make it look like random violence. Gyeonggu has enough crime that 2 more bodies won't attract attention. Mi Suk-chin will grieve, but he'll understand it's the price of his carelessness. He'll refocus on the syndicate. The engagement proceeds. The merger continues." And if he doesn't understand, if this changes him permanently, then we eliminate him too and install new leadership. Your father has 3 lieutenants capable of running the GM Seoul operations. The organization matters more than any individual, even Mi Suk-chin, especially a version of Mi Suk-chin who's compromised by sentiment. Min-hee closed her eyes and ran the probability matrices. If she ordered this hit and Mi Suk-chin discovered her involvement, he would retaliate with the full force of the syndicate behind him. But if she didn't order the hit and the council discovered his secret family, they would view her as either complicit or incompetent. Neither was survivable. The political calculus was clear. The woman and children were threats to everything Min-hee had spent 5 years building toward. They represented instability in a system that required absolute predictability. They were evidence that Mi Suk-chin was no longer the weapon the syndicate needed him to be. They had to be eliminated. Not because Min-hee was jealous. She'd never wanted Mi Suk-chin's love, only his power. Not because she was cruel. Cruelty implied emotion, and this was pure strategy. But because allowing them to exist meant accepting that the man she'd built her political future on was fundamentally compromised. "Make it clean," she said into the phone, her voice carrying no hesitation because hesitation was how you lost everything in their world. "Professional team. No connection to the syndicate. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong or domestic violence from the neighborhood. I want them eliminated within 72 hours. And Mi Suk-chin, if he's there during the operation." Min-hee paused. This was the calculation that would define everything. Kill the father along with the children and risk complete chaos in the syndicate, or leave him alive to grieve and potentially discover her involvement. "Avoid him if possible," she said finally. "But if he interferes with the operation, treat him as any other obstacle. The mission objective is elimination of the woman and the twins. Anyone who prevents that becomes secondary target." "Understood. I'll assemble the team." Min-hee ended the call and returned to her Pilates mat, resuming her exercise routine as if she hadn't just ordered the execution of 2 infants and their mother. Her breathing remained controlled, her movements precise. This was business. This was survival. This was what power required when sentiment threatened to destabilize everything. The photographs sat on the bench beside her yoga mat, evidence of Mi Suk-chin's weakness. Evidence that the glacier had melted into something useless. Evidence that he'd chosen wrong when forced to decide between empire and family. Min-hee's father had taught her early. In their world, you didn't get to choose both. You didn't get to build empires while playing house. You didn't get to be both the monster and the man. Mi Suk-chin had tried to split the difference. Now his children would pay the price for his arrogance. Min-hee completed her routine, showered, dressed, and prepared for a lunch meeting with potential investors as if this were any other day. Because it was any other day. Just another calculated move in the endless game of power. Just another elimination in a world built on eliminations. Just another reminder that sentiment was the fastest route to extinction. She didn't think about the infants' faces in the photographs. Didn't consider what it meant to order the death of 4-month-old children who'd committed no crime except being born to the wrong parents. Those were thoughts for people who could afford conscience. Min-hee had built her life on more practical foundations. Mi Suk-chin was installing child-proof locks on the cabinets, an absurd precaution given that Kai and Ezra couldn't even crawl yet, but Gabrielle had mentioned it was something to prepare for, when his phone vibrated with a pattern that made his blood freeze. 3 short pulses. Pause. 2 long pulses. The emergency code D-gun used when death was imminent and seconds mattered more than explanations. He pulled the phone from his pocket, still holding the screwdriver, and saw the message that rewrote reality. "Hit team, your location, 2 minutes out, 4 operators, professional grade, get them out now." Gabrielle was in the bathroom, taking advantage of the twins' nap to shower for the first time in 2 days. The water was running, which meant she couldn't hear him, couldn't hear the sudden silence that preceded violence, couldn't hear the shift in air pressure that told him trained killers were already in the building. Mi Suk-chin moved with the efficiency of 20 years surviving ambushes, dropped the screwdriver, crossed to the drawer crib where Kai and Ezra slept peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling with the rhythm of new life that had no concept of how fragile existence was. Scooped both of them up with the careful speed of someone who'd learned to balance gentleness with urgency. They stirred but didn't wake, their trust in him absolute and terrifying. The bathroom door. He kicked it open without ceremony. Gabrielle's scream cut off the moment she saw his face, not the face he wore when changing diapers, but the face that had ordered executions without flinching. "Get dressed. Now, we have 90 seconds before people with guns reach this door." To her credit, she didn't waste time with questions. Grabbed the clothes she'd left on the sink, pulled them on with shaking hands while water still dripped from her hair. Her eyes found the twins in his arms, and something primal and maternal transformed her expression from fear to pure protective fury. "Who?" "Later, closet. Get in the closet and don't make a sound no matter what you hear." "I'm not hiding while you." "You're protecting our sons while I handle this." He thrust the twins into her arms, gentle despite the urgency, despite the countdown running in his head. 60 seconds, maybe less. "Closet, now. If I tell you to run, you don't look back, you don't hesitate. You take them and you disappear and you let me handle this." Gabrielle's jaw clenched, but she moved to the tiny closet that barely fit one person, let alone a woman and 2 infants. She folded herself into the space with the twins pressed against her chest, and Mi Suk-chin saw her lips moving, singing, he realized, humming something to keep them calm even as her own hands trembled. He closed the closet door and turned to face the apartment entrance just as the first pick scraped against the lock he'd installed 3 weeks ago. Professional entry. Quiet. Efficient. The kind of approach that meant these weren't random thugs but trained operators who'd studied the layout, timed their assault, planned for resistance. Mi Suk-chin had left his weapons in the car, Gabrielle's rule, the price of admission to his sons' lives. For 3 weeks he'd honored that rule, had entered this apartment unarmed and vulnerable and human. That decision was about to cost him everything. The lock clicked, the door started to open. Then the hallway exploded with violence. D-Gun's voice cut through the chaos. "Down, get down," followed by suppressed gunfire that sounded like industrial staplers combined with breaking bone. The door slammed shut as bodies hit it from the other side. Men screaming, return fire, the specific sounds of professionals killing each other with efficient brutality. Mi Suk-chin dove for the kitchen area, grabbed the largest knife from Gabrielle's minimal collection, positioned himself between the door and the closet where his entire world was currently compressed into 15 square centimeters of darkness and fear. The door burst open. A man entered, tactical gear, suppressed pistol, professional stance, and made it exactly 2 steps before D-Gun appeared behind him like a nightmare and opened his throat with clinical precision. Blood sprayed across Gabrielle's carefully organized space, across the baby clothes hanging to dry, across the life Mi Suk-chin had been trying to build from the ruins of his empire. "Stairwell's clear," D-Gun said, already moving to check the window. 2 down, 2 retreated, but boss," his expression went grim. They knew exactly where to find you. This was targeted. Someone sold you out." Mi Suk-chin's mind was already calculating, processing, arriving at conclusions that felt like knives twisting in his chest. Professional hit team. His location. Perfect timing when he'd be here, but the guards he'd stationed outside would be rotating shifts. Someone with access to his schedule. Someone with motivation to eliminate complications. Someone engaged to him. "Min-hee," he said, and the name tasted like poison. "That's my assessment." D-Gun was checking the dead operator's identification, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd searched corpses before. "This is Ti-Yong's crew. He's been making moves, testing loyalty, asking questions about alternative leadership structures. He wouldn't move without authorization from someone higher up the chain." The closet door cracked open, and Gabrielle emerged with the twins, her face pale but composed, her hands steady despite the body cooling in a pool of blood 3 meters from where her children slept. She looked at Mi Suk-chin, then at D-Gun, then at the blood spreading across her floor, and her expression went to stone. "This is your world," she said quietly. "This is what you bring. This is why I left. This is what found you anyway." Mi Suk-chin moved toward her, but she stepped back, clutching the twins tighter. Gabrielle, they know about you now. They know about Kai and Ezra. Hiding won't protect you anymore. The only thing that protects you is me choosing to burn down everyone who threatens you. Or you choosing to walk away and let us disappear for real this time. That's not an option anymore. Degun's voice cut through their standoff. Boss, she's right that your world found her, but she's wrong that leaving will solve it. Minhee ordered this hit because the twins are threats to her political position. That doesn't change if Mi Sukchin walks away. It just means she'll have time to send better operators when his protection isn't here. Gabrielle's face crumbled, just slightly, the armor cracking to show the terror underneath. So what are you saying? That we're dead no matter what? That my children are casualties in your power struggle whether you're here or not? I'm saying the only thing that keeps you alive now is me making it too costly to try again. Mi Sukchin looked at his sons, at their peaceful faces unaware of how close death had come, at their absolute trust in a world that wanted them eliminated. I'm saying I can't have both worlds anymore. I can't be the glacier and your children's father. I can't maintain the empire and protect you. I have to choose. Choose what? Gabrielle's voice broke. Choose to be the monster who kills everyone who threatens us. Choose to teach your sons that violence is the only answer. Choose to become exactly what I left. Choose to stop pretending I can be anything else. He met her eyes, and she must have seen something in his expression because she went very still. The moment they sent killers after our children, they declared war, and I've spent 20 years learning how to win wars. I just never cared about the stakes before. Degun's phone buzzed. He checked it and his expression went darker. Boss, we need to move. Backup team is 5 minutes out. Tiyong's bringing more operators. He's committed now, either he succeeds or you eliminate him. No middle ground. Then there's no middle ground. Mi Sukchin turned to Gabrielle, and his voice carried the weight of everything he was about to do, everything he was about to become in order to keep her alive. I'm taking you somewhere safe, somewhere even the syndicate can't reach, and then I'm going to end this. How? She was crying now, tears streaming down her face while she held their children. How do you end this without becoming the thing I can't let near our sons? I don't know, honest answer. The only answer he had left. But I know that letting them die because I wanted to pretend I could be gentle isn't an option. I know that your principles don't matter if you're dead. I know that our sons deserve a father who chooses them over everything, even if that father is a monster. He moved to the window, checking sight lines, calculating escape routes, shifting back into the tactical mindset that had kept him alive through 2 decades of warfare. Behind him, Gabrielle was singing to the twins again, that soft humming that meant comfort and safety, and everything his world had never provided. The throne or the cradle, Degun said quietly, checking his weapon. You really choosing the cradle, boss? You know what that costs? The syndicate won't accept it. Minhee's family won't accept it. The council won't accept it. You're choosing war with everyone you've ever allied with. I'm choosing my sons. Mi Sukchin looked at Kai and Ezra, at their tiny faces and impossible fragility, and the way they trusted that the world would keep them safe despite all evidence to the contrary. Everything else is just details. Degun nodded slowly, and something that might have been respect crossed his scarred face. Then we move now. I've got a safe house in Incheon, fortified, supplied, unknown to anyone in the syndicate. We get them there, we dig in, and then you decide how to burn down everyone who threatened them. Mi Sukchin took one last look at the apartment where he'd learned to be human again. At the blood now staining the floors, at the baby clothes that would never be worn because this place was contaminated beyond redemption, at the small space where he discovered that love was heavier and more important than any empire. Let's go, he said, and helped Gabrielle gather what little they could carry before the backup team arrived and the war began in earnest. The double life was over. Now there was only the choice he'd made and the consequences that would follow. The glacier had melted completely. And what emerged was something far more dangerous than Minhee could have anticipated. A father with nothing left to lose. The Grand Hyatt ballroom glittered with enough wealth to feed Gyrogu for a decade. Crystal chandeliers cascaded light over tables draped in silk, over centerpieces that cost more than most people's monthly salary, over the assembled power structure of Seoul's underworld dressed in tuxedos and designer gowns, and the veneer of civilization that money could purchase, but never actually create. Mi Suk-chin stood at the head table beside Min-hee, wearing the mask he'd perfected over 20 years, the glacier, cold and controlled and absolutely lethal. But underneath the tailored Tom Ford suit, underneath the platinum cufflinks, and the watch that cost more than Gabrielle's yearly income, his hand rested on the Sig Sauer P226 holstered against his ribs. Tonight, the mask came off. Tonight, everything burned. Min-hee was radiant in crimson Valentino, her hair swept up to showcase the diamond necklace her father had given her to commemorate the merger. She smiled at the assembled guests with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won, who thought the hit team's failure was merely a temporary setback, who assumed Mi Suk-chin would fall in line once he'd grieved appropriately and remembered where his loyalties belonged. She had no idea he'd spent the last 72 hours preparing for war. "You seem tense," she murmured, leaning close enough that her perfume, expensive, carefully selected to project power without femininity, invaded his space. "This is supposed to be a celebration, our family's uniting, the beginning of a new era for the syndicate." "It is a new era," Mi Suk-chin replied, his voice carrying the same cold precision it always had. "Just not the one you anticipated." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but before she could respond, her father stood to give the opening toast. Gar Donghyun, patriarch of the Gar family, 73 years old and still commanding enough presence to silence 300 criminals with a gesture. He raised his champagne glass, and the ballroom fell into respectful quiet. "Tonight, we celebrate more than a marriage," Donghyun began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 generations of accumulated power. "We celebrate the consolidation of Seoul's future. The Gar family and the GM Seoul syndicate, united in purpose, unstoppable in execution. Together, we will. Together, you will answer for attempted murder." Mi Suk-chin's voice cut through the speech like a blade through silk. He stood, and 300 heads turned toward him with expressions ranging from shock to calculation to the predatory interest of people who sensed blood in the water. Min-hee's hand closed on his arm. "Suk-chin, what are you?" He shook her off and pulled out his phone. D-Gun had prepared the presentation, had compiled the evidence, had ensured that what happened next would be undeniable and irreversible. Mi Suk-chin pressed a button, and the massive screens flanking the stage, intended to display romantic photographs of the happy couple, instead showed surveillance footage of the hit team entering Gabrielle's building. The ballroom erupted in murmurs. Mi Suk-chin let them watch the next 30 seconds, the operators moving with professional precision, the ambush in the hallway, D-Gun's intervention, the bodies cooling in pools of blood 3 meters from where infant children slept. "4 days ago," Mi Suk-chin said, his voice carrying over the chaos without needing amplification, "my fiancé ordered the execution of my sons, 2 4-month-old infants whose only crime was being born with my blood. She sent professional killers to eliminate children who couldn't even crawl yet because they threatened her political ambitions." Min-hee was on her feet now, her face a careful mask, but Mi Suk-chin could see the calculation behind her eyes. Deny everything. Claim fabrication. Turn this into a question of his stability rather than her guilt. "This is insane. Suk-chin, you're clearly under tremendous stress. Perhaps we should." "I have the operator's phone records." Mi Suk-chin gestured, and the screens switched to show call logs, text messages, payment transfers. D-Gun had been thorough. "Direct communication with Lieutenant Taeyong, who received orders from you 3 hours before the hit. I have testimony from the surviving operator who confirmed that you authorized the contract. I have financial records showing payment from accounts your father controls." The room had gone silent now, everyone recalculating alliances and survival odds based on this new information. Donghyun's face had gone from shock to fury to something more dangerous. The cold assessment of a man realizing his daughter had compromised everything with her overreach. "You ordered a hit on his children." Donghyun's voice was quiet, which made it more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "Without consulting me, without considering the political ramifications." "They were impurities." Min-hee's control finally cracked, and the real her emerged, the woman who viewed human life as chess pieces to be removed when they cluttered the board. Mixed-blood bastards born to some foreign teacher he was slumming with. They had no place in this organization. They would have contaminated everything we've built. I was protecting the integrity of the merger. You were protecting your ego. Mi Sukchin's hand moved to his weapon, and every bodyguard in the room tensed. And you failed. My sons are alive. My sons are safe. My sons are under protection that would require an army to breach. And now everyone in this room knows exactly what you are and what you're willing to do to maintain power. He turned to face the assembled crowd, the syndicate's leadership, the rival families, the politicians and judges and businessmen who formed the ecosystem of Seoul's underworld. These were the people who'd shaped him, trained him, turned him into the weapon that had served them for 20 years. I declare Kai Iverson and Ezra Iverson my legitimate heirs, he said, and felt the words reshape reality. They carry my blood. They bear my protection. Any action against them is an action against me. Any threat to their lives will be answered with total war. You can't be serious. One of the council elders stood, a man named H. Wang who'd been in the syndicate longer than Mi Sukchin had been alive. They're mixed blood. They violate every tradition we've established. The purity of the bloodline is bullshit. Mi Sukchin's voice went cold enough to freeze the room. The purity of the bloodline is how old men maintain control by limiting who gets to inherit power. It's gatekeeping disguised as tradition. It's racism packaged as culture. And I'm done pretending it matters more than my son's right to exist. The ballroom erupted. Half the room on their feet, shouting about tradition and protocol and the sanctity of the old ways. The other half calculating whether this was an opportunity or a threat, whether Mi Sukchin's declaration meant weakness they could exploit or strength they needed to respect. Minhee's hand moved toward her clutch, toward the weapon Mi Sukchin knew she carried because he'd trained her himself. He was faster, had his Sig Sauer drawn and pointed at her chest before her fingers touched the purse. Around the room, bodyguards drew their own weapons, each one making a split-second decision about which side of history they wanted to be on. You're choosing them over everything, Minhee said, and her voice carried genuine disbelief. Over the syndicate, over the merger, over your legacy. You're throwing away an empire for two bastards you've known for 3 weeks. I'm choosing them over everything that doesn't matter. Mi Sukchin kept the weapon steady, his eyes on hers. And that includes you. That includes this organization. That includes the empire I've built on corpses and lies and the pretense that any of it was worth the cost. Dong Hyeon's voice cut through the chaos. If you walk out that door, you're an enemy of both families. You'll have no allies, no protection, no resources except what you can carry. We'll hunt you. We'll find them. And next time we won't send 4 operators, we'll send 40. Then come. Mi Sukchin began backing toward the exit, his weapon still trained on Minhee, his peripheral vision tracking every threat in the room. Come with everything you have. Bring your armies. Bring your resources. Bring the full weight of the organization I've served for 20 years. And discover what happens when the weapon you created stops following orders and starts protecting the only things that actually matter. The first shot came from H. Wang's bodyguard, a young operator who'd probably thought he was earning points with the old guard. Mi Sukchin dropped him with a double tap to center mass before the man's weapon fully cleared its holster. The ballroom exploded into violence. D-Gun appeared at the service entrance with 3 men loyal to Mi Sukchin rather than the syndicate, operators who'd chosen the warrior over the organization. They laid down covering fire while Mi Sukchin fought his way toward the exit, each step a calculation of angles and threats, and the necessary violence to create a path to freedom. A bodyguard moved to intercept him. Mi Sukchin put 2 rounds through his knee and kept moving, disabling, not killing, because he was trying to be someone different even in the middle of warfare. Another threat emerged from behind a pillar. D-Gun handled it with clinical efficiency. Minhee's voice rose above the chaos. Every family in this room, kill him, and I'll triple the standard contract price. His head is worth 50 million won. The room shifted. Professionals who'd been fence-sitting suddenly had motivation beyond politics. 50 million won was retirement money. Mi Sukchin became the most valuable target in Seoul in the span of a sentence. He made it to the service corridor with D-Gun covering their retreat. Behind them, the ballroom was a war zone, families choosing sides, operators shooting at each other, the merger gala transforming into exactly the kind of violence the syndicate usually inflicted on others rather than itself. "Cars outside," Degun said, reloading while they moved. "Gabrielle and the twins are in Inchin. Safe house is fortified. But boss, we just declared war on everyone, every family, every operator, every ally you've ever had." "Good." Mi Sukchin burst through the exit into Seoul's night, into freedom that felt like falling, into a future with no structure except what he built himself. Let them come. Let them bring everything. Let them learn that the man who terrified them for 20 years is infinitely more dangerous when he's protecting something he loves. They reached the armored SUV. Degun drove while Mi Sukchin reloaded weapons and calculated what came next. Behind them, sirens wailed. The Grand Hyatt security, the police who'd been paid to ignore syndicate business, the chaos spreading through Seoul's underworld as news of the schism traveled at digital speed. Mi Sukchin pulled out his personal phone and called Gabrielle. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with fear she was trying to hide. "It's done," he said. "The bridges are burned, the empire is gone, and I'm coming home." "Home," she laughed, hollow and breaking. "Sukchin, you just declared war on everyone you've ever known." "I declared war on everyone who threatened our sons." He watched Seoul blur past the window, the city he'd controlled, the empire he'd ruled, all of it irrelevant now compared to reaching Inchin and the cramped safe house where his entire world waited. That's all that matters. Everything else is just details. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Gabrielle's voice emerged soft and fierce and terrified and brave. "Then come home to us, and we'll figure out what happens next together." Mi Sukchin ended the call and watched the empire he'd built disappear behind him. The glacier had melted. The monster had chosen the man. And whatever came next, he'd face it not as the head of the syndicate, but as a father willing to burn down the world to protect his children. It was the only choice that had ever mattered. The Mediterranean sun filtered through linen curtains, painting golden stripes across the terracotta floor of the villa. Mi Sukchin woke to the sound of chaos, not the controlled chaos of syndicate operations, but the beautiful, exhausting pandemonium of 2-year-old twins who discovered how to escape their cribs and had decided that 6 a.m. was the perfect time to practice their newly acquired climbing skills. A small foot connected with his ribs, then another. Kai had somehow scaled the side of the bed and was now using his father's torso as a launching pad, giggling with the unrestrained joy of a toddler who had no concept of personal space or appropriate wake-up methods. Ezra appeared moments later, army crawling across the pillows with the focused determination of someone on a critical mission, though the mission appeared to be reaching the nightstand where a glass of water sat precariously close to the edge. Papa up! Kai's Korean was emerging in fragments, blended with Italian phrases he'd picked up from the neighbors and English words from Gabrielle. The result was a linguistic chaos that somehow perfectly captured their new life, unstructured, multicultural, absolutely incomprehensible to anyone from Mi Sukchin's former world. Papa is attempting to continue breathing, Mi Sukchin said, gently redirecting Kai's foot before it could connect with something vital, which requires that small humans stop using him as playground equipment. Ezra had reached the water glass. Mi Sukchin's hand shot out with the reflexes that had once disarmed opponents, now repurposed for preventing toddler disasters. He caught the glass milliseconds before it tipped, set it safely out of reach, and found himself being tackled by both twins simultaneously. They'd grown so much in 2 years. Kai had his blue eyes and his reckless confidence, already showing signs of the charm that would either make him irresistible or insufferable, possibly both. Ezra had Gabrielle's analytical mind, her careful way of observing the world before engaging with it, her tendency to solve problems through patience rather than force. Both had inherited his thick dark hair, which now stuck up in directions that defied physics and grooming products. Both had their mother's smile, which they deployed with devastating effectiveness whenever they wanted something. Both were absolutely, completely, terrifyingly fragile in ways that still made Mi Sukchin's chest tighten with protective instinct. "Dada!" Kai pointed toward the bedroom door, where Gabrielle stood with her arms crossed, trying to look stern despite the smile tugging at her lips. Her hair was longer now, sun-lightened from afternoons on the beach. She wore paint-stained jeans and one of Mi Suk-chin's old shirts. He'd stopped owning tailored suits 18 months ago, had burned the last one in a symbolic gesture that had felt ridiculous and necessary. "Dada is being conquered," Mi Suk-chin reported, now pinned beneath two giggling toddlers who discovered that tickling was an effective dominance strategy. "Send reinforcements or coffee, preferably both." "Reinforcements don't arrive for men who promise to handle morning duty so their exhausted partners could sleep in," Gabrielle said, but she was already moving toward the bed, already reaching for Ezra, who decided that hair pulling was an acceptable form of communication. "You said, and I quote, 'I've survived assassination attempts. I can handle 2 toddlers.'" "I may have underestimated the lethality of toddlers." She laughed, the sound that had first made him forget about protocol and empire and everything that didn't matter. The sound he'd chased across an ocean and through 2 years of rebuilding his entire identity. The sound that now filled this villa on the Amalfi coast, this life they'd constructed from the ruins of everything he'd destroyed. They'd chosen Positano for its beauty and its remoteness from the Korean underworld. The villa clung to the cliffside like a stubborn promise, overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea that changed color with the light, turquoise in morning, sapphire by afternoon, ink black under stars. Mi Suk-chin had purchased it through shell corporations so buried that even his former contacts couldn't trace the ownership. Here, he was Michael Chin, not Mi Suk-chin. Here, he ran a small security consulting firm that specialized in protecting wealthy clients from exactly the kind of threats he used to create. Here, his most dangerous daily activity was preventing Kai from trying to climb the villa's exterior walls or stopping Ezra from conducting scientific experiments with how far things could be thrown from the terrace. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 20 years becoming the most feared man in Seoul's underworld, and now his greatest challenge was convincing 2 tiny humans that eating vegetables wasn't a form of torture, and that bedtime was non-negotiable despite their eloquent arguments to the contrary. Gabrielle had started teaching English again, online classes for Korean students, the work she'd loved before his world had consumed her. She taught from the villa's converted studio while the twins napped, her voice carrying through the open windows along with the scent of lemon trees and the distant sound of waves against stone. They'd built something here, not an empire. Empires were cold and fragile and maintained through fear. They'd built a life, messy and chaotic and sometimes overwhelmingly difficult, but real in ways his former existence had never been. The kitchen was already a disaster zone by the time they got the twins corralled for breakfast. Kai had discovered that yogurt could be used as architectural medium, constructing what he insisted was a castle, but looked more like abstract expressionism across his high chair tray. Ezra was methodically dissecting his fruit, arranging pieces in careful patterns that suggested either future genius or obsessive-compulsive tendencies, possibly both. Mi Suk-chin cleaned yogurt off surfaces, while Gabrielle negotiated with Kai about the structural integrity of breakfast foods. This was fatherhood. Endless cleaning, constant negotiation, the strange satisfaction of small victories like getting both children to eat something resembling nutrition before 9 a.m. His phone buzzed, the secure one, the one only 3 people in the world had the number 2. Degun's message was brief, annual status report, Seoul's quiet. Minhee married a politician. Your name is legend, not target. Clear skis. Mi Suk-chin deleted the message and pocketed the phone. That world still existed. The syndicate had survived his departure, had reorganized, had continued its operations with new leadership and old methods. But it existed somewhere else now, in a reality he'd evacuated completely. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn when old instincts woke him, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. If abandoning everything he'd built, everyone he'd commanded, all the power he'd accumulated was worth it for this life of domesticity and diapers and the endless chaos of raising children. Then Kai would climb into his lap with a book about dragons, or Ezra would grab his hand with sticky fingers and pull him toward some urgent toddler crisis, or Gabrielle would catch his eye across the breakfast table with an expression that said, "We survived this together," and the question answered itself. The old guard had believed that a man who changes diapers was weak. That tradition mattered more than human life. That maintaining power required sacrificing everything soft and vulnerable and human. They'd built their empires on that foundation and called it strength. But Mi Suk-chin had learned a different truth in this villa on the coast. In the arms of his sons, in the life he'd chosen over everything, the real strength wasn't in maintaining the ice. It was in letting it melt. It wasn't in building fortresses that nothing could penetrate. It was in opening yourself to the terrifying vulnerability of loving something more than power. He'd been the glacier for 20 years, cold, controlled, absolutely lethal. Now he was just Papa, covered in yogurt, negotiating with tiny terrorists about nap time, discovering that the weight of 2 toddlers climbing on his back was heavier and more important than any empire he'd ever ruled. Kai and Ezra would grow up knowing their father as the man who made breakfast and told stories and built sandcastles on the beach. They wouldn't know about the violence, the empire, the monster he'd been before they existed. That past was sealed away, accessible only in the scars he carried, and the nightmares that still came sometimes when the wind off the Mediterranean sounded too much like Seoul's streets. Gabrielle caught his hand as they watched the twins demolish their breakfast with the enthusiasm of small humans who viewed mealtimes as contact sports. Her fingers intertwined with his, hands that had held weapons and corpses now holding the only thing that mattered. "You okay?" she asked softly, reading the expression that meant he was thinking about before. "I'm home," he said, and meant it completely. The promise he'd made that night in Incheon, to choose them, to burn it all down, to become someone worthy of being their father, had been kept. Not perfectly, not without scars and nightmares and moments of doubt, but kept nonetheless. The monster had been unmade. And what replaced it was a man covered in yogurt, negotiating with toddlers, discovering that the only wealth that ever mattered was sitting at this table, demolishing breakfast, completely unaware that their existence had rewritten their father's entire reality. Mi Suk-chin had held gold bars and weapons, and the weight of an empire. Nothing had ever been heavier or more precious than this. The old guard believed that a man who changes diapers is weak, and that tradition matters more than human life. That outdated mindset creates villains. Comment "family over empire" below if you would have burned it all down just like Mi Suk-chin did. Let us know your choice.